of the joy of writing is to do with the pleasures of language and the sounds of it. And I was very lucky. My first teacher of writing was the wonderful, wonderful Kashmiri poet Agha Shahid Ali. And the first day in Shahid's class, we walked in and he said, "I want to make you so sensitive to language that you won't be able to hear a single word without having an emotional response to it as a sound." And I remember being really skeptical and thinking, am I going to have a response to the word "the"? And of course, even as I say it, you realize I don't much like the word "the" as a sound. It's kind of, the. But he was wonderful in sort of making you see language as sound and the possibility of it. And he used to say a poet should mine a word for all the possible layers of meaning within it. And he became someone who was very important to me for my prose fiction, that this sense of language and what can be done with it.
Well, you certainly acknowledge his name, and one realizes that he's had an important role, so it's very nice to have you tell us that role. What about the poet Nizam Hikmat? Is that through Agha Shahid Ali, or?
Shahid introduced me, Shahid actually embarrassingly had to be the one to introduce me properly to Fairs. Obviously I knew Fairs, but I hadn't really read Fairs until I went to America and met this Kashmiri who said, "I'm not going to talk to you until you go and read Fairs," and pulled out a book of Fairs and said, "Go away." Through Shahid also I came to know other writers who weren't sort of part of sort of Anglo-Saxon canonical texts. So Pablo Neruda, Nazim Hikmat, Amichai, Octavia Paz, a whole bunch of Czesław Milosz, a whole bunch of writers from very different places, a lot of whom were writing from very difficult countries with very difficult political and historical contexts, and were finding a way to write it without compromising their aesthetic, which to Shahid was, who was writing about Kashmir, was always the really crucial thing, that you do not a syllable of your aesthetics gets compromised by your need to say something about the political world.
Well, they always say that the test of a really good teacher is when the student surpasses the teacher.
Well, that certainly hasn't happened. No,
so that's all right. Well on the way there. I'm sure there are plenty of people in the audience who would like to ask questions, and I don't know if there is a microphone that is going around. Do we have a handheld mic?
Can I ask, since we only have about 5 minutes, that those people who already asked questions,
if you're willing to come
in the
here
informal section, if you could leave it for people who haven't yet had the opportunity, that would probably be the gracious thing to do. So having said that, now no one wants to ask. Oh yes, there's someone right there.
I just wanted to know a very, very simple question. Which one would be your favorite?
Which is my favorite? Now this is posed as a simple question. This is not a simple question. Would you stand up and say to a parent, who is your favorite child? Of course, the children here, and
the children can always answer.
Yes, well, I'm not about to say that my books can hear my answer, but actually the honest answer is it's always the one I've just finished, if I haven't yet started the next thing, or it's the one I'm working on at that moment. So at the moment, it's the one I'm working on at that moment, which is just another way of saying your deepest emotional involvement with a novel is at the moment you're working on it. In some odd way, as soon as it becomes published and it's out in the world and other people are developing emotional responses to it, you start distancing yourself, which is probably a very good thing, because when people say that was a terrible book, you don't have to take it personally. You think, well, yeah, that maybe, but this next one's going to be really good. Any other question? Oh wait, sorry. There's someone at the back who hasn't had a question.
He has the mic. He has the mic.
This gentleman has had several questions,
okay,
so I'm going to ask the person at the back. If you can shout it out well enough.
I think pass the mic, because it's nice for the audience to hear.
Ashar has a deep voice. We can hear him.
Fellow Cape here, and I just wanted to know. You've written a lot of op-eds, opinion pieces in various British newspapers, especially in terms of the relationship between the West and the East. Have you thought about writing a political novel specifically looking, from the perspective of a global citizen and your role in that global village?
I'm not a global citizen. I'm a Karachi girl who lives in London. I'm very much shaped by this context. And now that I moved to London, by London, rather than even Britain, So I think this phrase global citizen, it's funny, I was at the Jaipur Festival last week, and there was a conversation on globalization, and one of the writers there was saying, this is a globalized world, we are globalized citizens, and the other writers, who included Chimamanda Adichie and Orhan Pamuk, absolutely disagreed, and I'm with them, and Chimamanda Adichie said, I had to go through hell to get a visa to come here, how can I be a globalized citizen? And Pamuk sort of brought up the point that when he writes a love story, people will say, this is a Turkish love story, whereas if an English writer writes a love story, it's a love story. We are certainly not in a globalized world, but I mean, I do move around. To that, Ashram, I'm not arguing your point that that I have relationships of living in Karachi, in London, and in parts of the east coast of America. I never sort of think of writing novels in terms of, this has been my life, how do I put it in? To me, I like to leave my life behind as far as possible when I'm writing a novel, and sort of try and imagine something completely different. But of course, the unconscious is always working away, and you never know what's going to come out. And what comes out has to do with your experiences and what's interesting you in the world. And so Burnt Shadows certainly was a book that, in part, I know must have come out the fact that, post 9/11, on September 11th, I was living in London. 6 weeks later, I was back in Karachi. And 2 months after that, I was in New York. And I saw this sort of one moment in these 3 different places, and what the people of these different places were saying about each other. And this sort of weird sense you have of being in those moments and understanding that historical point of view, even if you disagree with it, totally understanding the history behind it. And so that certainly came into Burnt Shadows, in the writing of Burnt Shadows, where you had different people from different countries with very different histories behind their back, and what those interactions were doing. But I don't know what happens next, and what books will get written, and what part of my own experiences will feed their way into it.
I want to announce a last-minute rescue by Amina Saeed. She said we have the full hour. So we get an extra 15
hour?
In other words, we get an extra 15 minutes.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So if we started at 11:30, we can finish at 12:30.
I think this just means that our lunch hour is going to be
and
curtailed.
that means that all the sessions have been extended until 12:30. So nothing new will be starting until 12:30.
Now we can be
so
luxurious about questions and
more
answers.
questions.
Okay. There's a question at the back there, the gentleman. If you
If
could wait for the
somebody
mic.
can hand the mic, because it does make a difference if the rest hear the question.
Kamala, delightful comments, thank you. As you think about all the writings that you do, I'm sure there are thoughts behind it, but I'm curious, what's the deepest purpose of your life?
The deepest purpose of my life, it's quite honestly not a question I ask. And I don't think of what is the purpose of my life. I think of, I think of writing as the thing, when I do it, I feel most myself. I mean, that would be my answer to it, rather than talk about purpose, which sounds to me a little bit lofty. I don't know, I don't feel that there's some, it almost, makes sound as though someone up there is saying, you must write. And I don't think my writing is, of that sort. I don't think very many people is, and I don't think it's very helpful to think of your own writing in that way. But I spend a lot of time not writing. The last couple of years I've been, being a writer now sometimes means you spend a lot of time not writing because you're talking about your last book at different festivals in different places. So I was not writing for a long time. I was traveling around a lot, which I love. And then a few months ago I started writing a new novel. And I called up a friend of mine and I said, I wasn't conscious of being at all unhappy in the last year or so, but I must have been in some way unhappy because I'm so happy to be writing now. And this feels, that it feels like, oh yes, how was I not doing this for all this time? So I don't know that answers your question, but it's a kind of answer.
It does. I mean, you're saying that you share. I mean, your purpose is to share your own unique experiences.
Well, I think you're possibly being too generous to me, because it's taking. I write because of the pleasure it's giving me. It's a delight to me if other people, once they've read the book, can come up to me and say, this is what your book meant to me. But at the moment I'm sitting and writing a book, quite honestly, I'm not thinking of anyone else. I'm not thinking, this is a message I must spread, this is an experience I want to share. I'm thinking, this is what I want to be doing right now. This is the story I'm interested in. And you hope that the story you're interested in and the way you're telling it will be of interest to other people. The relationship with the book is a very interesting thing. It's always one-on-one. Even if 10 people are sitting reading the same book, it's not like 10 people watching a movie where you're all watching that moment. That's still a personal relationship because you're responding to that moment in a different way. But with a book, it's you and the text. And that's actually no different if you're writing it. It's you and the text. All the other readers of the book will have their own relationship to it. And you hope, as a writer, you hope it's largely a good experience. But when I'm writing, it is, I hate to call it selfish, but in some way it probably is. It's sort of very, it's very absorbed with the book for the sake of the book itself.
I like very much what of the writing situation where you have the dilemma of needing to be out in the world in order to have material to write about, and you have to withdraw from the world in order to be able to write it. So actually what you were describing is exactly that Mobius strip.
The writer for me who I was having a conversation with Nadeem Aslam, who's a writer who's very extreme in his writing. So when he writes, he goes and he sits in a darkened room. He literally puts blinds on the window and it just disappears from the world for months. It doesn't have a TV, there's no email or phone to reach him by. When his novel Naps for Lost Lovers was published, a lot of the newspapers were sort of publishing these stories about this very extreme form of retreat. And there was one day when he sort of called me and he got really upset and he said, I realized reading these interviews that it sounds as though I'm a writer who thinks in order to write I must be completely disengaged with the world. And he said, I wish what I had put through in this was that I can only withdraw or retreat in a certain way at a certain point, but there has to be constant involvement and engagement as well in what is happening and what people are reading and what they're writing and what they're doing. This sort of need to be immersed and aware of what's going on in order to then move into that period of total retreat. And I think he does it in an extreme way, but I think all writers do it to some extent.
Do we have more questions?
Any other questions? There's someone there.
You're ignoring this gentleman here.
Because this gentleman has had three
The
questions.
gentleman behind you.
Oh, there's someone, he's already had a question.
You keep track better than I do.
Well, no, these were before you came in.
I see.
What's your opinion on translations of your own work into European language? How would you feel about it?
What is my opinion of translations of my work? Well, I'm very glad for the translators of the world. Burnt Shadows is translated to 23 languages. The great sadness to me is that Urdu is not one of those languages, neither is Punjabi, Sindhi, Saraiki, Balochi, Pashto. None of the languages of Pakistan other than English. It's been translated into Marathi. It's been translated into Arabic, into Chinese, Indonesian.
Japanese?
Not Japanese. Not Dari, not Farsi. So it's been translated into many of the European languages, into Spanish, into Portuguese, into various others. But it's mainly Europe that these 23 translations, I think about 17 or 18 of them are in Europe. And it's a wonderful thing because it means your book is reaching people who you never imagined. It's also a sort of odd thing because I receive copies of all of them. Of all the translations, and I sort of open it up and think, I have no idea. I have no idea whether this translation is better than my original, whether it's missing something crucial, whether it's added something in that is really interesting, but I don't know about. I don't have that experience. There are some writers who know the languages that they're being translated into and then can talk about really interesting conversations with their translators. And I've never been able to do that because I've never known any of the languages I'm translated into. But I think the process of translation, certainly, I rely on translations to give me the Russian novelists and the French and everyone else. So I think there should be much more of it. And it is, of course, the translator is not just a scribe. You know, they're not just writing a different font. There's an artistry to it, which I think I'm hugely in awe of.
Mm.
Yeah.
2 more questions, and then I think we shall have to wind up. So may we ask the gentleman there?
Do you ever find yourself censoring yourself consciously or unconsciously when you write?
Do I ever find myself censoring myself consciously or unconsciously? This is, of course, a very important question today. I mean, there's a session going on now which I wish I could be in, which is Literature in the Age of Extremism. I'm not consciously aware of ever having censored myself. But last year I was chairing a discussion in London between a number of writers from Singapore. Now, as we know, Singapore is a country where, let's just say, freedom of the press is not exactly enshrined in any way. So I was talking to these writers, and I, you know, as sort of gently as possible, because I didn't want to get them into trouble, with representatives of the Singapore government who were sitting there, I brought up this issue of self-censorship and censorship. And there were, I think, 5 writers there, and 4 of them were sort of so dismissive of the question and said, you know, one said, well, I write about homosexuality, and I'm thinking, well, the Singapore government doesn't have a problem with that. You know, do you write about the Singapore government? I didn't say this. But 4 of them were sort of insistent and adamant that there was no question of censorship, and their work didn't go through a censorship board, there was no issue. And the 5th writer said, if you grew up in Singapore, the great success of the Singapore state is to have made us all self-censors of ourselves. So the state doesn't have to do it. And then it can appear that we're all writing what we want, but we know in our hearts that there's certain areas which it would be very unwise to go to. So our unconscious will stop us from going there before our conscious is even aware of it. So we don't even have to think to ourselves, I have self-censored myself. And I do wonder about this. I don't know. I mean, that's the thing about the unconscious, is I don't know. These are obviously very scary times these days in Pakistan after what happened to Salman Taseer, and the silence we've seen. We've